In tonight's news edition, His Majesty the King receives the annual report on human rights in the kingdom and urges further action to enhance rights and freedoms. The Prime Minister brings lawmakers up to date on the government's measures to deal with the Syrian crisis, and the House Speaker says there's no need now for a state of emergency. And the United States urges the Syrian president to surrender chemical weapons to avert a military strike. Good evening and welcome to the news. His Majesty the King said the National Center for Human Rights, the NCHR, has a pivotal role in Jordan's comprehensive reform process. King Abdullah spoke as he received a copy of the 9th Annual Report on Human Rights in the Kingdom in 2012. In a meeting with Chairman of the Centre's Board of Trustees, Muhammad Adnan al-Bakhit, the King said efforts should be pursued to enhance human rights, raise community awareness and address rights-related issues in a neutral and independent manner. Bakhit also handed the King a national plan he had previously ordered to be drafted to spread and promote the human rights culture for the next 4 years. Another point emphasized by the King was coordination between executive, legislative and judicial authorities to put in place timetables and practical programs to carry out the recommendations of the National Center for Human Rights report. He voiced the hope that such proposals would help the government to update human rights and freedoms strategy to achieve justice and equality among all. King Abdullah also lauded the Human Rights Center for monitoring parliamentary and municipal elections. His Majesty the King called on the command of the 30th AlHussein bin Ali Special Mission Brigade for a briefing about the brigade's tasks and training programs. King Abdullah, the Supreme Commander of the Jordan Armed Forces, watched a 4-wheel drive vehicle manufactured by the King Abdullah II Design and Development Bureau, which was recently introduced to the armed forces. The King issued his directives to various units to maintain the brigade's level of proficiency and reputation. Prime Minister Abdullah updated lawmakers on Jordan's position towards the dramatic developments related to the Syria crisis. 77 MPs have requested the meeting to discuss the conflict in Syria and its repercussions on the kingdom in view of a threatened US-led military attack against the Syrian regime. Lower House Speaker Saad Al-Srour said lawmakers were in agreement with the cabinet that Jordan will not be part of any military intervention against Syria. He said they were also unanimous that Jordanian territory should not be used for any military strike and that a political solution in the avenue forward in a way to safeguard Syria's unity. He said the informal meeting tackled the government's preparations to deal with any potential risks, adding he trusted the ability of the government's various agencies to protect the country and its people. He said the current situation does not warrant a declaration of a state of emergency. Earlier in the day, Prime Minister Mansour updated United Nations Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Valerie Amos on the repercussions of the Syrian crisis on the kingdom. He told Amos that the kingdom's hosting of a rising number of Syrian refugees had placed heavy burdens on the country. The refugee influx into a country with limited resources, he said, is exerting an enormous challenge for the services sector, mainly infrastructure, education, health and labor. He said the assistance to Jordan by donor nations and organizations is not enough. Mansour also said Jordan is ready for any emergency in case of an anticipated foreign military intervention in Syria. Amos, who's on a regional tour, said the United Nations recognized the huge burden posed by refugees on Jordan, adding that the United Nations would help Syria's neighbors to deal with the refugee influx. Foreign Minister Nasser Judah also discussed services provided to Syrian refugees and the need to provide better living conditions for them and the internally displaced people as well. Judah pledged Jordan's continued cooperation to facilitate the work of UN agencies in the kingdom. Britain has announced a new aid package of up to £30 million for Syrian refugees in Jordan. British Secretary of State for International Development, Justine Greening, said her country is committed to supporting Jordan to shoulder the burden of hosting more than 500,000 displaced Syrians. She told a press conference in Amman that the UK is the second biggest donor to Syrian refugees after the United States, having contributed £87 million since the outbreak of the Syrian crisis. Greening said she was shocked by the rising number of Syrian refugees, noting that about 1/10 of Syria's population are refugees, and urged the world community to provide more assistance to them.
But Britain is very clear that, as a country, we need to stand by Jordan. Jordan has been immensely generous in allowing so many refugees to come into its country and not only go into camps like Zartri, but to be part of local communities. I think the international community needs to fulfill its responsibility in working with Jordan to help shoulder the burden of those huge numbers of refugees. And that's why I was here today, not just to see for myself some of the challenges that the Jordanian people and Jordan faces, but also to announce additional British support.
The White House said 14 more countries have signed on to a statement condemning Syria for a chemical weapons attack and calling for a strong international response. The additional countries brought the total number backing the statement to 25 as the United States tries to marshal international support for military strikes against Syria. Meantime, the United States said it will seriously look into a Russian proposal to put Syrian chemical weapons under international control, but it is skeptical. Luay Balqa reports on the debate on a possible military intervention in Syria.
President Barack Obama's right-hand man, Secretary of State John Kerry, is trying to convince the Congress that an intervention in the Middle East is necessary. Kerry issued the ultimatum as he toured European capitals to garner support for intervention in Syria. Kerry said Syria could prevent a military attack if President Bashar al-Assad hands over all his chemical weapons to the international community within next week. But he said the Syrian leader is not about to do it, and it cannot be done.
He could turn over every single bit of his chemical weapons to the international community in the next week. Turn it over, all of it, without delay, and allow a full and total accounting for that. But he isn't about to do it, and it can't be done, obviously.
He also addressed the wide public reluctance to enter another conflict in the Middle East and insisted that it would be a very limited intervention.
We're not talking about war. We're not going to war. We will not have people at risk in that way. We will be able to hold Bashar al-Assad accountable without engaging in troops on the ground or any other prolonged kind of effort, in a very limited, very targeted, very short-term effort that degrades his capacity to deliver chemical weapons.
Russia has asked Syria to put its chemical weapons stockpile under international control in a bid to avoid US military strikes and then have them destroyed. At a meeting with his Syrian counterpart, Walid al-Muallim, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov also urged the US to concentrate on peace talks instead of a possible military strike on Syria.
More and more responsible political leaders share our views that the military scenario will end up in rampant terrorism, not in Syria, but also in neighboring countries. It will end up in a drastic rise of refugees, which is already taking place.
The Syrian Foreign Minister suggested a chemical attack was a pretext to encourage military intervention. In an interview with the CBS Charlie Rose, President Bashar al-Assad warned of a possible retaliation against the United States should the country intervene in his nation's civil war.
You should expect everything, not necessarily through the government. It's not only the governments are not the only player in this region. You have different parties, you have different factions, you have different ideology, you have everything in this region now. So you have to expect that.
Tell me what you mean by expect everything.
Expect every action.
And as the US Congress returns to Washington after a summer break, the US President is facing an uphill fight. Several prominent lawmakers say they haven't been persuaded to approve a strike against Syria, and the Senate could vote as early as Wednesday. Luay Balqar for the news at 10.
The UN nuclear watchdog will look into a request from Russia to assess the impact if a missile were to hit a small Syrian reactor, and is considering the issue. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA's 35-nation board, is holding a meeting this week. But Russia said last week a military strike on Syria could have catastrophic effects if the research reactor near Damascus that contains radioactive uranium was struck by design or by chance. It called on the IAEA to urgently assess the risk as the United States considers military action to punish Syria's government for an alleged gas attack. Russia said nearby areas could be contaminated by highly enriched uranium.
We have to address the technical aspects. There are certainly political aspects and legal aspects. And it is mentioned that this is related to military action. So there are various aspects. And it is also useful for us to hear the views from the member states during the course of this Board of Governors meeting. And the list is not exhaustive. We have not yet decided which aspect we will address, but already we can see this is a complicated issue. It has various aspects, and we need to look into these aspects.
UN Human Rights Chief Navi Pillay said there's little doubt chemical weapons were used in Syria. Speaking during the opening session of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, Pillay said the international community should act urgently, but she warned against military action, saying it may result in more deaths and more widespread misery.
This situation cries out for international action, yet a military response or the continued supply of arms risk igniting a regional conflagration, possibly resulting in many more deaths and even more widespread misery. There are no easy exits, no obvious pathway out of this nightmare except the immediate negotiation of concrete steps to end the conflict. States, together with the United Nations, must find a way to bring the warring parties to the negotiating table and halt the bloodshed.
While in London, US Secretary of State John Kerry held talks with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, which he described as productive and informative. A US State Department statement said Kerry and Abbas discussed the ongoing talks and how to intensify them to guarantee their success. Kerry urged both sides to take steps to create an atmosphere for peace and reiterated Washington's commitment to play an effective role in that respect. He said both Palestinians and Israelis were determined to pursue direct negotiations.
And it was a very productive and informative session as part of our ongoing efforts in the Middle East peace process. The negotiators are negotiating. We have said we're not going to discuss the substance on an ongoing basis, and we're not. But I'm encouraged that even though there have been difficulties along the way on both sides in their countries, in their territory and in the country, nevertheless, they are staying at it.
A happy ending for a man who disappeared 4 months ago in the remote Andes Mountains in Argentina. A 58-year-old Uruguayan was found alive after he spent a brutal winter eating rats and raisins to survive. In May, Raul Fernando Gomez set out to cross the mountains from Chile to Argentina on foot because his motorcycle broke down. He then reportedly lost his way during a snowstorm. Gomez spoke by phone to friends and family. His daughter, Paula, said his family was thrilled but shocked. Serena Williams claimed the title of the US Open Women's Championship. She beat second seed Victoria Azarenka 7-5, 6-7, 6-1 at the Arthur Ashe Stadium in New York. It looked like it was going to be plain sailing for Williams after she won the first set, but Azarenka fought hard in the second set after Williams served for the match at 5-4 and again at 6-5 before Azarenka rose up to break the America's serve and forced a tiebreaker. In winning the title world #1, Williams claimed her 5th US Open crown and 17th career Grand Slam singles title.
Ladies and gentlemen, your 2013 US Open.
Olimpo have secured the first win of the Argentine Premier Division season with a 3-0 victory over Boca Juniors. The hosts took the lead in the 7th minute when Martin Perez Guedes finished from close range after a shot from Damian Mosto was deflected into the right winger's path. Striker Augustin Volitek doubled Olimpo's lead and Guedes again scored the 3rd goal in the last 20 minutes of the match. The win has taken Olimpo from 2nd to 17th in the 20-team Premier Division with 5 points, while Boca sit 11th with 9 points after their 3rd defeat in 5 matches. Finally, a quick look at the weather. Pleasant tonight across many regions and fair elsewhere with winds with northwesterly light winds. Tomorrow, a slight rise in temperatures is expected. However, normal summer conditions will continue in the hilly areas and relatively hot conditions are expected in the Badia and the desert region. Further south, the Gulf of Aqaba should expect a hot day tomorrow with northerly brisk winds and slightly choppy seas. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. Now the day's top stories once again. His Majesty the King received the annual report on human rights in the kingdom and urges further action to enhance rights and freedoms. The Prime Minister brings lawmakers up to date on the government's measures to deal with the Syrian crisis, and the House Speaker says there is no need now for a state of emergency. And the United States urges the Syrian president to surrender chemical weapons to avert a military strike. And that's the end of tonight's news. I'm Rad Abdullah. Thanks for watching and have a good night.